How to Net Zero. In this lecture, I will finish my discussion of Bill Gates' book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. The key to avoiding climate disaster, according to Gates, is reaching net zero greenhouse emissions. He even has a timeline. He thinks that developed economies should reach net zero by year 2050, and others should follow them as soon as possible. What do you think about this timeline? Is it too ambitious? Is it too slow? Gates believes that the only way to reach net zero within this time frame is to reduce green premiums to zero or less. For this to happen, he believes that three forces must work together. These are technology, policy, and markets. Technology is the totality of all scientific discoveries and new industrial methods that will create low-emission alternatives and lower green premiums. Policy is the sum total of all government interventions, laws, and regulations. And market is made up of the companies and investors that develop green technologies and the consumers that demand such technologies. According to Gates, technology is the primary one in the trio. So ultimately, the goal is supplying the technologies that will reduce green premiums. But these three interact with each other. The key is to create synergy between them. To understand why technology alone cannot solve the problem, we need to understand economics a little. According to the classical economic theory, the supply of any good or service is driven by the demand for it. When demand goes up, that causes supply to go up. And that happens a lot of times. For instance, when the global economy started recovering from the pandemic, the previously depressed oil demand went up. That made the gas prices increase, which made oil extraction more profitable, which will, we hope, incentivize oil production. So eventually, supply will catch up to the demand. We can also apply this idea to the availability of green technologies. When technology demand goes up, we can predict that it will cause the technologies in demand to emerge as a result of the increased incentive to produce those technologies. To make it more concrete, here is how it can play out. If we believe people like Bill Gates, the world is facing a global crisis. Unless we find a way of reducing our net emissions to zero, we are toast. That incentivizes smart people to come up with technologies that will help us reduce our net emissions to zero. So sooner or later, the supply will materialize and we will transition into a 100% green economy. But there is a problem with this picture. The problem is this. The classical economic theory does not generalize. Indeed, sometimes the causal link between supply and demand gets inverted. So although in some cases demand going up causes supply to go up, sometimes it is the other way around. Supply going up causes demand to go up. What I'm describing here is called induced demand. Induced demand happens when increasing the supply of something increases the demand for it. Here's an example. Unfortunately, we are all familiar with traffic congestion. Fundamentally, traffic congestion is a simple phenomenon. It is nothing but the demand for roads exceeding the supply of roads. There are too many cars and too few lanes for them to travel on, so they need to wait for their turn to go. That elevated demand for more roads has a predictable effect. We build more roads and we expand the existing roads. So the increased demand causes an increase in supply, as classical economics predicts. That should end traffic congestion, right? But it doesn't. It doesn't because traffic congestion has a function. It deters people like me from driving. Because the highway is so miserable every day, I live near downtown where I have access to public transportation. But now that the city expanded the road network quite a bit, it is not as miserable to do a big commute every day. So I and thousands of others moved to suburbs and start commuting by car to their jobs in the city every day, which within months creates the same old traffic congestion, if not worse. Of course, now that I bought a house in the suburbs, I'm locked into commuting. It will be really hard to change my lifestyle at this point. What I've just described is an example of induced demand. The increased availability of roads caused an increase in the demand for roads. In case you are interested in this example and its implications about urban policy, I'm linking an article in the video description. If you aren't convinced, here's another example. This is an old hard drive. It's a copy of the first hard drive I've ever owned, a Seagate ST4096. Its capacity is 2 megabytes. If you don't know what that means, a megabyte is 1,000th of a gigabyte and 1 millionth of a terabyte. When I owned this hard drive in the early 1990s, I couldn't have imagined why anyone would need a gigabyte of storage. I didn't even know what a terabyte was. Yet, today, even consumer-level solid-state drives can easily hold terabytes of data. What happened? You can again try to understand what happened by using classical economic theory. You could reason that since the demand for data storage went up, the supply for data storage eventually caught up. But that is a tiny part of what happened. Remember, people couldn't have imagined needing even a gigabyte of storage in the early 1990s. So there was no demand for this. What happened, for the most part, is actually induced demand. The more storage space we got in our computers and later mobile devices, and finally in the cloud, the more space we needed. This is because the availability of more storage space influenced our behavior. We kept more and bigger files. This is my Google Drive capacity report. I have 2 terabytes of space, more than half of which I'm using. I do this by hoarding pictures, videos, movies, games, and the size of those files increases as well. And I'm not alone. How many of you find your phone memory to fill up in a matter of months after purchasing it? This happens because the availability of high-capacity storage encourages consumers to create and store more media. That, in turn, increases the demand for storage even higher. And it is not just a matter of the number of pictures and videos we keep. When digital video first became a thing, a single frame contained only about 25,000 pixels. In comparison, today's standard is 4K, which contains more than 8 million pixels. What's more, frame rates went up from 24 to 60, resulting in monstrous video file size. So availability of more storage created a need for even more storage by changing what we store and how much we store. That's why the classical economic theory captures only part of the relationship between supply and demand. The relationship between the two is often like the relationship between a chicken and an egg. But what does this have to do with reaching net zero, you might be asking? Consider electric cars, for instance, which currently have a minute market share. Only about 2% of new car sales are electric. And this lack of demand is unsurprising given the green premiums attached to them. Electric cars are substantially more expensive than gasoline cars to purchase and maintain, which, unsurprisingly, depresses the demand. But why are they so expensive? A big part of the answer is the low supply. In order to reduce the cost of a product, you need to make and sell lots and lots of it. That's why Honda can make a gasoline car for 16 grand, but the cheapest electric car costs about double that. But the depressing effect of low supply on the demand doesn't end with just the cars themselves. Even the unavailability of the infrastructure reduces the demand for electric cars. These are how many fast charging stations there are in some major US cities. Compare that to how many gas stations there are in each city. And here are the totals. As you can see, the number of fast charging stations are substantially lower than gas stations. And this lack of sufficient charging infrastructure is both a cause and an effect of low numbers of electric car sales. I personally know at least a dozen people who would have bought an electric vehicle, but the lack of infrastructure deterred them. So the converse of induced demand is also a threat. If we don't make the supply available, demand will not increase as fast. And how fast the demand materializes is important because remember, we need to reach net zero in less than 30 years. If that was a bit too much, here is the bottom line. Green premiums of things like electric cars and solar panels won't come down unless they and the relevant infrastructure are made available in quantity first. And that's why Gates thinks that technology, policy, and markets should all work together. So let's look at what Gates thinks should be done in terms of government policy. The first one on the policy list is straightforward. We need to increase research and development investments. Technology is expensive to develop. Governments have a bunch of money. Instead of spending it on, let's say, strafing brown people in the Middle East, we should probably spend it on research. Next, Gates thinks that governments can incentivize technology development and deployment by private entities. For instance, they could guarantee loans or give tax breaks for installing electric heating. Then there's what Gates calls tech neutrality. He thinks that governments shouldn't play favorites when it comes to developing technology. Whatever works should be embraced. Whatever doesn't work should be abandoned. Another thing governments can do, but private companies currently cannot, is to build the infrastructure necessary for some technologies to work. For instance, the US government can create the necessary fast charging infrastructure in the bigger cities and along the interstate highways. This is essential for inducing mass demand for electric vehicles. This is an immense undertaking. Installing underground power cables across a large city would cost billions of dollars. Without sufficient return on investment, only the federal or state governments can do this. Another idea is to change the rules so that green products can become competitive. One example is to authorize the use of green concrete in projects that doesn't require the high compressive strength of dirty concrete. Another idea is to set new building code and permit standards so that old buildings can be retrofitted with flood protection quickly, and new buildings must be constructed in a way that will make them resilient against storms. If these changes are made, old and dirty technologies will continue to dominate the market. Another idea is the standardization of clean electricity, fuel, and products. We all hear the terms green, sustainable, and environmentally friendly, but the truth is no one knows what exactly these terms mean. Besides, most products and services aren't ever investigated in an objective way to determine their environmental impact. For instance, several of you stated in your comprehension says that an iPad is more environmentally friendly than buying paper books and newspapers. You might be right, or you might be wrong. We don't know because all we can go by is Apple's own statements, according to which the latest generation iPad requires about 40 kilos of carbon dioxide to be released, which amounts to about 120 paperback books. However, there is currently no federal law that requires Apple to be truthful in such a statement. What Gates wants is the environmental equivalent of nutritional labeling. We can tell just by looking at a box of cereal what exactly is in it. Similarly, we should be able to tell by looking at the label on a plastic toy for a kid how much CO2 is released to make and transport it. And not just for toys, but for everything. Houses, cars, plane tickets, computer parts. They should all have clear and governmentally enforce labels that inform the consumers so that we aren't deceived by buzzwords like sustainable and green, which don't mean anything right now. Another thing that the government could enforce is a carbon price. This could come in the form of a carbon tax, which will be levied from companies releasing CO2. It could also be made tradable so that individuals and companies who would like to reduce their own emissions can pay a carbon capture business to raise their carbon footprint and thus avoid the extra taxes. Another big thing only governments can do is replacing the old machines and infrastructure in place. For instance, governments can buy back older cars and offer rebates for electric cars. They could also enlarge urban sewer systems to prevent flooding. Understandably, Bill Gates thinks that for these changes to happen, all branches of governments should work together. In the case of the United States, this means the federal government, state governments, and local governments. But what do you think? Are these ideas plausible? Can any of them backfire or lead to increased corruption? Of course, governments don't exist in a vacuum. At least in democracies, government policy correlates with public opinion. So there could be something we can do as individual citizens. Gates thinks that making calls and writing letters to our representatives and attending town hall meetings are all good ideas. These can make an effect because politicians care about getting reelected. If you tell them that you vote, and you won't vote for them unless they get their act together, it might make an impression. Gates also thinks that we should focus on local decisions over which we have a lot more influence than national decisions. In a national issue, or even a state-level issue, the odds of one vote determining the outcome is so bad you might as well start buying lottery tickets. But local decisions give individuals more power. If you attend student senate meetings, for instance, you could not only sway elections with your own vote, but also persuade others to change their minds. And although it might sound like a long shot, Gates thinks that we should also consider running for office. What do you think? Are these good ideas? Is he missing anything important? Then there are the markets, which is a combination of consumers, companies, and investors. Gates argues that asking people to reduce their consumption is a dead end. Later in the course, we will revisit this idea and examine it critically. But Gates argues consumers could still do other things to make a difference. One of them is signing up for green pricing programs. Where I live, for instance, if you are willing to pay about 25% more for electricity, you can sign up for a program that pinky promises that your electricity comes from a renewable source. We can also reduce our home emissions by installing more efficient appliances and light bulbs, or even setting the thermostat a degree higher in the summer and a degree lower in the winter. Of course, this is a way of reducing our consumption, but Gates doesn't seem to notice that he is contradicting himself by telling us to reduce our consumption only a few pages after predicting that such advice is futile. Gates also thinks that we can buy electric vehicles. We could also eliminate or reduce our meat consumption. If we feel up for it, we can even boycott industries and businesses that use or profit from animal products. What do you think about these proposals? Would they be effective? And finally, we often have professional roles, which give us the power to influence the policy of the businesses or organizations we work in. Again, Gates thinks that there are lots of possibilities here. We could, for instance, try to set a carbon tax system internal to the company we work for or own. For instance, at the university, each department could have a carbon quota, and if they emit more than that, they would lose part of their funding. Similarly, if a department emits less than their quota, they can be rewarded. We can prioritize innovation in low-carbon solutions to new and old problems. For instance, instead of executives like Bill Gates flying in private jets, they could take the lowly first class with the rest of us plebs. Gates also invites us to be early adopters in green technologies. Another advice of his is to be active in policymaking. A certain type of person steers clear of political issues in a professional setting. Gates thinks that this is unwise. We should go to meetings where the institutional rules are made and speak up about our minds. Another idea is to take advantage of government resources. Often, federal, state, and local governments are willing to help out businesses which are interested in going green. However, governments suck at letting you know how to get help. Therefore, a little bit of digging could be necessary. Finally, especially if we are in a decision-making position in a large institution, we could help innovators survive the early stages of research and development. Most environmentally oriented startups run into brick walls because they can't get the financial backing they need to bring their products to the market. If a large company supports them in the early stage, they could succeed rather than fail. Again, what do you think about these proposals? Are they realistic? I also want to briefly address what Bill Gates says about political polarization. As you probably know, our society is very divided on key political issues such as healthcare, immigration, racism, and economic inequality. The most divisive issue, however, is climate change. Whereas 73% of liberals recognize it as a very big problem, only about 17% of conservatives do so. As you can imagine, this makes a significant number of proposals he made about government policy impractical. As a democracy, we simply cannot invest the enormous resources that are needed into solving a problem if about half the population don't even think that the problem exists. Bill Gates recognizes that there is no magic solution to polarization. However, he recommends us to focus on the facts. He quotes Hans Rosling, who said, "When we have a fact-based worldview, we can see that the world is not as bad as it seems, and we can see what we have to do to keep it better." Does trying to reframe climate change conversation in terms of facts strike you as a plausible way out of polarization? I'm skeptical, primarily because I think Gates is getting political psychology wrong. But I won't bore you with the details. If you are interested in learning more on the psychology of political polarization, I would strongly recommend the book The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Now, let me take the kid gloves off and explain what I think is a fundamental failure of Bill Gates' book. To explain this fundamental failure, I need to first explain a thought experiment called the prisoner's dilemma. It's often used in political philosophy and economic theory. Here's the setup for the experiment. There are two prisoners. Let's call one of them prisoner A and the other prisoner B. These prisoners are in jail and are being accused of a crime, which they supposedly committed together. The investigators give prisoner A two choices. You can either confess that you and the other prisoner committed this crime together, or you can remain silent. Similarly, B is given two choices as well. He can either confess to have committed the crime together with A, or he can remain silent. If they both confess, they will have a moderate sentence of 5 years each. If A remains silent and B confesses, the prosecution will give B immunity in return for testifying against A, and B will go free. A will receive a 20-year sentence. Similarly, if B remains silent and A confesses, A will go free and B will be sentenced to 20 years. And if they both keep their mouths shut, the prosecution will not have enough evidence to keep them in jail for very long. They will just stay 1 year each and they will be set free after that. Let's think about it from A's point of view. If B were choosing what to do at random, the expected prison sentence for A would be 2.5 years if he confesses. This is because if B were choosing at random, the odds of a 5-year sentence for A would be 50%. The odds of a 0-year sentence for A would be also 50%. The average is 2.5 years. As you can see, the expected sentence for confession is less than the expected sentence for silence, under the assumption that the other side is choosing randomly. As you can see, the expected sentence for confession is less than the expected sentence for silence, under the assumption that the other side is choosing randomly. Of course, if we look at it from B's perspective, we can make the same deduction. If A were choosing what to do at random, the expected sentence for B would be 2.5 years if he confesses, whereas the expected sentence for B would be 10.5 years if he remains silent. Again, the same result. The expected sentence for confession is less than the expected sentence for silence, under the assumption that the other side is choosing randomly. This is of course not rocket science. Both prisoners know that the expected sentence of confession is less than the expected sentence for silence, assuming that the other side is choosing randomly. Precisely because of that knowledge, neither side will choose randomly. They will both tend to choose confession. But this is bad for both prisoners. They had a much better outcome available to them in which they could have had only a year each. But because they were acting selfishly and couldn't trust the other prisoner, they ended up getting 5 years each. As you can see, prisoner's dilemma is useful for understanding why people who aren't closely related to each other have a difficult time cooperating with each other. If the prisoners were siblings, for example, they could trust each other not to confess and reach the mutually beneficial result. But if they are strangers to each other, they will likely find themselves getting 5 years each, although they could have each reduced their sentence by 4 years. We can apply the prisoner's dilemma to climate change. Imagine a world like ours, where there are only two countries, country A and country B. Each country has two choices. They can either continue to burn fossil fuels or work towards net zero emissions. If each continue to burn fossil fuels, their economies will continue to grow fast, at least for a while, but they will face a climate disaster in the long run. If country A works for net zero and B burns fossil fuels, B will grow much faster than A, perhaps dominating it economically and militarily, but they will both face disaster in the long run. If A burns fossil fuels but B works towards net zero, this time A will dominate B economically and militarily, but they will again face disaster in the long run. The only good outcome for both happens if they cooperate and work towards net zero together. Only then they can slow down their growth but avert ecological disaster. Like the prisoners in the original experiment, one might think of countries as self-interested agents who act selfishly and are unwilling to cooperate. But a much better outcome is available if only they could cooperate. So the irony is the same. By choosing selfishly, A and B will lock themselves into a track heading for disaster. Of course, there are complications, and the complications, I would say, reveal the fundamental failure of Gates' plan for net zero. The first complication is the fact that in the real world, there aren't just two countries. There are many more. This introduces a phenomenon called the free rider problem. If nearly all countries make the sacrifice necessary to reach net zero, but my home country, Turkey, let's say, doesn't, the disaster will still be averted, and Turkey will benefit greatly from continuing to burn fossil fuels, whereas everyone else was scrambling to replace their cars and heaters with electric. Unfortunately, Bill Gates says nothing about the issue of free riding. A connected problem concerns the decision makers. Unfortunately, long-term harms won't deter most government officials. Above all else, politicians are motivated by one thing: how to maintain and increase their own power. If disaster will slowly ramp up and won't become unbearable for another, let's say, 70 years, it's irrelevant to Xi Jinping's and Joe Biden's power. It's so irrelevant it might as well be happening on another planet. Again, unfortunately, Gates says nothing on this issue of decision-maker psychology, which we will look into a bit more in the future. Finally, the cherry on top is uncertainty. We don't know how bad the outcome will be. We also don't know how effective or costly our efforts to reach net zero will be. We don't know what country will be harmed or benefited, how much based on the decisions they make now. And again, Gates says nothing to navigate this sea of uncertainty. In other words, Behind his veneer of practicality, Gates's book contains little actionable advice because it doesn't even acknowledge the political nature of the problem, let alone grappling with it. Instead, Gates presents the issue as a simple matter of fact. The earth is warming up because of us. If we don't change our ways, we are screwed. To change our ways, we need technology. For technology, we should all work together. So let's all work together. Unfortunately, this misses the point that self-interested agents in a chaotic situation which presents no deterrence against selfishness will often lock themselves into a suboptimal outcome. Here, I'm not denying that technology is essential. Of course it is. But unless we find a way to overcome our selfish and tribal natures, no technology can save us. Of course, that's only my assessment. What do you think? This brings me to the end of this lecture. Send me a message if you have any questions. Thank you for your patience, and I'll catch you next time.